Please welcome to the stage, Mark Redmond.
So I walk out to my car at the end of a long day of work. I'm tired, I have a long drive home, and it's only my 8th day in a new job. I'm director of what's called a residential treatment center for 72 at-risk teenage boys. It's in Dobbs Ferry in Westchester County, and it's called St. Christopher's. And when I get to my car, there's a flyer tucked in the windshield, and it's been handwritten and it's Xerox, and it says, "Rally behind the school tonight to protest the Rodney King verdict." So it was April 29th, 1992. And I had an assistant director, and I went up to him, I said, "What is this about?" He said, "Well, maybe you didn't hear, but the 4 police officers accused of beating Rodney King have been found innocent. And LA's going up in flames, there's riots going on in other cities, and I've been here long enough to know that if you don't do something fast, you're gonna have riots right here too." The 72 kids who lived at St. Christopher's all came from poverty. Most of them came from low-income area of New York City. If they knew their parents at all, their parents were in prison, or their parents were addicted to drugs or alcohol. Most of these kids had been in the foster care system their whole lives. You'd have a 15-year-old kid who lived in 15 different homes in his whole life. A lot of these kids have been gang members. A lot of them had a criminal background. They were in the juvenile justice system. And I got the job because the place was out of control. The police had been called all the time to St. Christopher's. Kids were going into town, stealing cars, breaking into homes. So it was my job to bring stability and civility and order. And I think this is important. Of the 72 kids who lived there was 1 white boy, 1 white girl. Almost all the staff were African American and Hispanic. The man I replaced, who'd been fired after 10 years, he was African American, and I'm white. Now you can see that, but if you ever listen to this in a podcast, I'm white. So I said to my assistant director, "Who do you think wrote this?" He goes, "Well, I think it's this kid, Joe." I said, "Well, let's go find Joe." So we went to this cottage, and there was Joe, 15 years old, African American, very nice kid. He's like, "Yeah, I wrote this. I'm organizing this." So it's funny, I didn't try and talk him out of it. I look back and think, why didn't I try and stop the rally? And I'd worked with at-risk kids for about 10 years at that point, and just my instinct was that to try and stop it would make it worse. So we said to him, "You know what, Joe? We'll have the rally, but can we move it indoors? Have it outdoors, you could lose control. We have this building, it's a chapel, why don't we do it in the chapel?" Joe said, "Fine." I said, "See you there in an hour." So I walked in an hour later, all 72 kids are there. They're kind of on the perimeter inside the chapel. There's one other white person, our psychologist. She was there. All the other staff are African American or Hispanic. And there's a big screen TV on, somebody's got on, and it's showing the infamous beating that everybody's seen for a year of these police officers beating and kicking Rodney King over and over. And it's also showing live shots from LA of cars being flipped, fires being set, awful, awful rioting. And I'm watching that, and I'm thinking, are we minutes away from that right here? So somebody turned off the TV, and then Joe got up in the middle, and he said, "You know, when I first heard about that verdict today, I was furious. I'm half black, so I consider Rodney King to be like my brother. And my first instinct was to do right here what they're doing in LA. Just start rioting, setting fires, flipping cars. But I've always followed the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King, and he taught to fight racism, but to fight it nonviolently, and that's what I'm gonna do." So he sat down, everybody clapped. In my mind, I went, "Phew." But 2 seconds later, another young man stands up, a little younger, he was like 14, Hispanic, and he says, "Wake up, kids, wake up! This place is racist and you know it. You all kiss the white man's ass." And he points to the white psychologist and says, "You all kick her ass." And then he points to me. "You're all gonna now start kicking his ass. I'm going into town and I'm gonna riot. Who's with me?" And he jumps up and he walks out that door, and I'm just holding my breath. I'm thinking, how many are going with him? 10? 20? Everybody? Nobody went. Staff member went to calm him down, but no kids went. So then we went around the room. No other kids spoke, interesting, but a lot of the staff spoke. I was 34 at the time. They were older. A lot of them were veterans of the Civil Rights Movement. They had been at the March on Washington with Martin Luther King, and they talked about that. They talked about the racism they had experienced in their lives and how they had dealt with it, and it was great. It was great. The messages they had for those kids were great. So this thing, after about an hour, I can tell this is going to end, and I'm thinking, I got to say something, right? I'm the new director. But I'm also conflicted. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, it's very easy for me as a white person to stand up here and preach peace and nonviolence. Because me and my family and my relatives and ancestors haven't been the ones crapped on for the last 500 years in a row. But I'm thinking, I gotta say something. So I raised my hand, Joe pointed to me, and I stood up. I said, hi. My name is Mark Redmond. I'm the new director. I've met some of you. I'm looking forward to meeting all of you. And I just want to say, that verdict today that they reached was wrong. I don't know how any juror can look at that video of those men beating Rodney King over and over and over again and find them innocent. This was a terrible miscarriage of justice. But you know what, kids? There have been miscarriages of justice going on in this country for a long time. I was 10 years old when Martin Luther King was killed. Here's a man who preached peace and nonviolence, gunned down in cold blood, a terrible injustice. The year I was born, 1957, was the same year Emmett Till, a 14-year-old young man, African-American from Chicago, visiting family in Mississippi, was beaten, strangled, drowned, killed by two white men for nothing, and they were found innocent. So there's a long history of injustices in this country, and I hate to tell you this, but there's going to be more, all right? And it could be another African-American person, could be a Hispanic person, could be an Asian person, could be a white person, but it's going to happen. And the question for you is, what position are you going to be in to do something about it? And the answer to that is in that schoolroom tomorrow. I said, look at Malcolm X. Who is it? Malcolm X started out as a drug dealer, a pimp, and a petty thief. But when he was in jail, what did he do? He taught himself to read. Malcolm X educated himself. Somehow Malcolm X knew that in order to fight racial injustice, he needed to be educated. And that's what you should do. So if you're pissed about this verdict today, it starts tomorrow in that classroom. So I sat down, and there was like a brief second, right? Like you're thinking, how was that received? And everybody clapped. They clapped, and it was like a good clap, it hit. So this Joe stands up. I had no idea what he was going to do. He says, everybody please stand up and hold hands. So everybody does that, and Joe's in the middle, and he goes, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. This is the Lord's Prayer. And St. Christopher's, despite its name, was not a religious institution. So it was very moving. We ended. I went up. I thanked him. I said, Joe, great job. Drove home. I lived in Borough Park, Brooklyn. And the next day, I showed up at St. Christopher's, and all the daytime staff were there. The people ran the school, and they were all like, Mark, you did it, man. You stopped the riot. Great job, Mark. I was like, I didn't really do it, It was Joe. It was the kid. Really, I did very little. No, it was you, Mark. Great job, So I called. I used to work in Williamsburg. I ran a home for homeless kids in Williamsburg. I called my boss. I'm like, I didn't really do much. Everybody's giving me the credit. It was really the kid. So he laughed. He goes, well, first of all, you didn't try and stop it, so that was smart. Take a little credit for that. And he said, besides, they'll soon be blaming you for things that aren't your fault, so take the credit. So here we are, 24 years later, right? And I'm sad to say my prediction that day has come true more than even I ever imagined, right? Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old kid with fucking Skittles in his pocket, and he's killed, and George Zimmerman is found innocent. Freddie Gray gets in a van with 6 police officers, comes out with his neck broken and he's dead. Nobody's guilty there either. Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old kid with a toy gun, nobody indicted. Philando Castile with a broken taillight, he's killed. It's just frigging endless. And I gotta wonder, did I give those kids the right advice that day, 24 years ago? Is that really the answer to racial injustice, to get an education? What would I tell those kids now? If I drove up to Dobbs Ferry right now, an hour away, and got the 72 kids living there now and got them in that chapel, would I give the same advice? And I think I would, but I'd add something else. I'd say, yeah, getting an education is key, but you also have to organize. You've got to lock arms with people who are just as outraged as you are and just as committed to seeing things change. Get involved with Black Lives Matter. Get involved with the NAACP. Education's vital, but it's not going to take you all the way. And until we lock arms and hearts and minds with people who feel the way you do, I don't see any way out of this terrible cycle of injustice and violence. I wish I delivered some version of that message to those kids in 1992. It is what I would tell those kids today. Thank you.